Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. And welcome back to our afternoon session. My name is Katrina Cunningham, and I'm based at University College Dublin in Ireland. And last year we hosted this workshop, and I have to say this year Dave has exceeded all expectations with the wonderful turnout. And I think you'll all agree it's been an excellent morning. And we hope to continue with the same and more in the afternoon. So welcome back, and we'd like to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Monica Beckmann from the University of Oslo. And we're going to have a focus on exercise interventions and fall prevention. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here to present this systematic review and meta-analysis called Effect of Exercise Interventions in the Early Phase to Improve Physical Function After Hip Fracture, which is under review in physiotherapy. Now, in my 10-year experience as a physiotherapist working in the nursing home, the interest of rehabilitation after hip fracture has always been present. In Norway, the patients after hip fracture have a very short hospital stay, and they are usually transferred to short-term stays for 2 to 4 weeks in primary health care before they are transferred home. It is with varying access to rehabilitation, but the patients are offered early exercise interventions. Apparently, the research base is quite small in this phase. So, a part of my PhD project, we investigate the short and long-term effects of a functional training intervention in the early phase on physical function and quality of life. So presently, we wanted to get an adequate overview of effects of exercises in the early phase. So, what is the difference between this meta-analysis and the meta-analysis already published? Existing meta-analysis includes studies with exercise interventions initiated directly after surgery and up to 1 year after the fracture. We wanted to investigate the effect of exercise interventions only in the early phase. So we define exercise interventions as planned and structured physical activity to improve or maintain one or more components of physical function. By components, we mean, for example, walking speed, balance, muscle strength, and endurance. And we have defined early phase as exercise interventions initiated within the first 3 months after hip fracture. So, why a meta-analysis? When low number of and small sample size studies, a meta-analysis can summarize and merge results from a number of individual studies. Thereby, we overcome small sample size of the studies. So, by combining studies, a meta-analysis increases the sample size and thus the power to study effects of interests. That's what I said. So, the aim is to evaluate the evidence on overall effect of exercise interventions to improve physical function in the early phase after hip fracture. We included RCTs assessing the effect of exercise interventions initiated in the early phase after hip fracture. The patients had to be 65 years or older, and trials included reported at least one performance-based outcome, such as walking speed, balance, mobility, and endurance. So, this is a flow chart of the screening and the selection process. Searches were conducted by 2 librarians in 7 databases. Duplicates were removed, and the result showed 2,225 articles. All the titles and abstracts were screened for relevance, leaving only 26 to be included for full text reading to further investigate the fulfillment of inclusion criteria. Finally, 9 studies were included in this meta-analysis. This is a table of the included studies. 9 studies of 669 patients in total. As the table shows, there is a great heterogeneity between the studies. Let me show you. Scale score is from 0 to 10, were used as a measure of risk of bias and the methodological quality of the individual trials. A study with a Pedro score of 6 and higher is considered level 1 evidence, where 6 to 8 is good and 9 to 10 is excellent. And a score of 5 and lower is considered level 2 evidence. The interventions took place either in the hospital or the community. Days in surgery is anywhere from 3 to 90 days. Sample size varies from 20 to 160 participants. And there were various outcome measures like walking speed, balance, mobility, and endurance. And of course, different type of interventions, all from high intensive progressive resistance training to endurance training and balance training. So, heterogeneous. The number of sessions was from 10 to 36. And the duration of the intervention was from 1 to 12 weeks. So, the question is it possible to compare and merge something that is so heterogeneous? Yes, it does. The data from each study was converted into standard scores in order to be able to compare them. In this table, we show one outcome measure from each study, in total of 4 different outcome measures. It was walking speed, endurance, mobility, and balance. The table show and statin mean different based on Cohen's d of 1.07 as well as positive CIs. Cohen's d indicates that an effect size from 0.8 and higher shows a large effect. The diamond, as you see, do not cross 0, so we can state that there is a statistically significant overall improvement in favor of the intervention groups. This means that early phase exercise interventions has a large effect on physical function. So we performed a meta-regression as well, in hope to try to find some relationships with the type of intervention and physical function, but without any results. It still remains unclear what kind of exercise intervention is superior and show the best effect on physical function in the early phase after hip fracture. Now, if we take a close look, we can see the contribution of each individual study on the overall effect. The further away from zero, on the right hand, the more effect. Now, if we pay attention to the study by Montecona, we can see a very large effect. We may pose the question whether this trial could have swayed the overall effects to positive, but random effect models, not including Montecona, still showed a large positive overall effect. We also did subgroup analysis for each outcome measure. The CIs are negative and the diamond crosses 0 on all targets. This means that there are no significant differences between the exercise and the control groups. One of the reasons for this may be because there are too few and relatively small studies, and due to the great heterogeneity between the studies. So, the small number of studies included in this trial may account for the underpowered analysis of the subgroup analysis being insignificant. And we may also say that one limitation is that we did not include this, any strength outcomes. There are meta-analyses that conclude of a better benefit of strength training exercise comparing to either other types of interventions. But we did not include a strength outcome in this meta-analysis. Despite the high heterogeneity among the studies on other variables, it was still considered sufficiently acceptable to permit a meta-analysis. One challenge in research is studies that show negative or no effects are more likely not to be published. That is what we call a publication bias. So we have to take this into account considering the few studies we included in our study. So, to our knowledge, this is the first systematic review and meta-analysis to summarize the evidence from exercise interventions in the early phase after hip fracture. Exercise interventions in the early phase after hip fracture have a positive effect on physical function, but it is unclear what kind of exercise intervention is superior to improve physical function in the early phase after hip fracture. So, we have this question of clinical implications. How can we implement these results into clinical practice? There are no guidelines for best practice in this phase, But based on our results in this meta-analysis, most types of exercises in the early phase after hip fracture are beneficial. What it is important is to tailor the exercise interventions to the patient's goals and needs. But if I can highlight some of the details in the included trials, we see that interventions who have outcome measurements that reflects the exercise interventions, they show the best results, both to measure the specific progress of the training, but also to improve the feeling of coping for the patients. For example, interventions consisting of balance training, choose an outcome that measures balance, and so on. In summary, measure what you exercise. So I just have to say thank you to these people, supervisors and co-authors, and to Astrid Viken for funding my PhD project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I think very interesting again to see the reporting of the exercise interventions that we do as physiotherapists, and our need to be a little bit more uniform maybe in how we report that, or standardized. We're going to welcome our next speaker now, Professor Kathy Sherrington. Thank you for coming back to speak.